Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint Tyranids using an example of Hive Fleet Tiamet. Now this video is going to cover a whole bunch of advanced techniques that hopefully you'll find really useful regardless of if you're painting Tyranids for your army or some other miniatures down the line. Can't wait to show you this one, so let's get into the painting. I've built this Tyranids termagant in two separate sub-assemblies for ease of access when painting, and I've undercoated the entire miniature with Carapace white. Our first painting stage is going to be using Vallejo's model colour 950 black, and all I'm doing here is going around the entire miniature and blocking out all of the areas of carapace and armour, purely so that we've got a nicer base coat foundation to work with when layering it in the green, and it's also going to help us keep things nice and neat throughout the entire painting process, to have all of these details separated out and we can focus on one area at a time. Remember, as always, to work with nice thin layers of paint, and it might take a couple of coats to build this up to full opacity, especially as we're going all the way from white to black, so be patient and remember to not work and agitate any areas of drying paint as you go, and build this up slowly until we have a full opaque base coat layer. It's not entirely necessary to paint the base as well, but I thought for this video it would be a lot easier and simpler to see what it is that I'm painting. However, if you'd like to do that, then that would be great as well. And also don't forget to block in the claws and talons with that black as well. The next thing that I'm going to do is go back in with that Carapace white and tidy up any areas of bleed where the black carapace went onto the body of the miniature. It's really important to do this now because we're going to be layering on lots of thin translucent layers to get that green colour, so it's going to be really difficult to tidy up after the fact. Make sure that everything is nice and neat before you move on with painting the next stages. Our first layer of colour comes from Sons of Horus Green from Citadel, and I'm going to be adding a lot of water to this paint to make it really thin and translucent. But also you'll see that I add in a little bit of glaze medium to thicken the body of the paint so that we ultimately end up with a very translucent finish. However, it's much more controllable, unlike a wash. Now, to make sure this applies nice and controllable to your miniature, one thing that I like to do is unload the brush on the back of my glove to make sure that it's not too wet. This will ultimately reduce the amount of paint that's being held within the bristles without wicking out too much moisture. And as you can see, I'm going to be applying this very directional onto the miniature in very thin layers to build up the colour slowly. Mostly I want this to collect and pull in the recesses so that we can bring out and start to define the shapes on the miniature. Try not to pass over areas where you've already been before the paint is dried. We're going to be adding this in multiple thin layers so you can build up that colour gradually over time, but if you want that really nice smooth finish, it's really important to just leave the paint and let it do its thing. That's how you're going to get a nice smooth blend. Slow and gradual layers, and we're going to be brushing very directionally, so our brush is always moving towards where we want most of the pigments to be deposited. In this case, that's going to be most of the recesses and the joints in between the limbs. Now I'm going back in with the Sons of Horus Green, although this time it's been diluted a tiny bit less and it's a little bit thicker and more pigmented. I'm only going to be brushing over areas where I've already deposited a lot of that paint in the previous step, and that will give me a really nice smooth blend and transition while still allowing me to build up a lot of colour and tonal variance on the model. Painting in this way by building up the colour slowly over a white base layer is really effective on miniatures, especially ones that have a lot of organic textures like Tyranids. It allows us to really bring out the volumes on the model for a very low effort as compared to something which is much flatter like a Space Marine. A lot of people speed paint Tyranids in a very similar fashion by adding a contrast paint or a wash over a light base coat also. However, I hope that this illustrates that just by breaking this down into a couple of thinner passes rather than one heavy wash adds a lot more visual interest onto the model, much smoother blends and transitions, and ultimately a lot more control of where you are placing the paint on the model, and it's going to give you a really high quality finish, much more akin to box art quality. If you're enjoying this tutorial, don't forget that you can catch the full extended masterclass over on our Patreon, where I'll be going into far more depth and detail about the techniques of how to paint this miniature. Plus, you'll also gain access to our entire back catalogue of video tutorials and PDFs, as well as a whole bunch of other benefits, so it's well worth checking out. The link is in the description of this video. Our next step is going to be very much like the previous layer. I'm going to add some Lupercal green into our previous mix and thin it down with the glaze medium and water once again. That's going to give me a darker paint and a little bit closer to the teal colour which I'm going for, but by applying it within about 75 to 80% of that previous step, it's going to give me a really smooth transition that I wouldn't have been able to get otherwise if I'd just gone in with this colour straight away. And as I said previously, I'm going to be applying this within that previous step, brushing very much directionally, pushing the pigment in towards those joints and recesses, and I'm trying not to brush over any areas of white as that's going to be my highlight later on. Remember that it's always better to build up this colour gradually in multiple passes, so even if it's not quite as potent as you're going for straight away, just let the area dry and work back over it later on and build up that colour slowly. That's going to give us that nice smooth transition and the smoothest blends overall. And once again I'm going to be darkening that colour even more, now with a layer of Incubi darkness. Remember to thin this down appropriately as we have with the previous steps, and if required, add in a tiny little bit of that Lupercal green into the mix to help smoothen that transition and make it a little bit less harsh. That's going to give us a really nice smooth blend and transition once more. We're going to start by doing our first highlight, which is with Carapace White. Now, obviously this was our base coat colour originally, however now that we've built up a lot of tinting and colour on the model, it's actually going to be a really nice subtle highlight which will work especially nicely in those areas where we've built up a lot of that green and teal colour. Study your miniature and look for those nice harsh and sharp lines where there is the bone detail, and we're going to be painting edge highlights over all of those. I was actually quite surprised at how incredibly detailed even just these small termagant models are, so really take your time to look for all of the areas which we can highlight. The more areas that you can bring out, the more detailed your miniature is going to look overall. Don't be afraid to make these lines a tiny bit wider than you are otherwise capable of, as that's going to leave us some room to highlight within later on with some pure white, adding even more contrast to the miniature and getting us closer to that box art finish. That being said, make sure you're really consistent with the line weight itself and paint every single area in the same sort of width, and that's going to give you a really uniform finish. Now I'm going in with a pure white, or in this case 951 white from Vallejo, and like I said previously, I'm placing this within that previous stage, but this time much sharper, more refined and narrower in width overall. Really take your time with this stage, and bear in mind that on camera this looks much more subtle than it does in person. Adding this final bright white highlight really adds tons of contrast and value to the miniature, and it gives us that really lovely finish, much akin to the box art style. Now we are moving on to the Tyranids Carapace and armour. Our first step is to add a layer of Incubi Darkness, which I've thinned down on my wet palette. Rather than doing this as an all over base coat, I'm trying to leave behind some of that black in the recessed areas. My brush strokes are always pulling away from that recess to hopefully deposit the pigment towards the tip of those armour plates. This is also a good time to start locking in that muscle memory of all of those striations which we're going to be picking out later on with the highlighting, but the sooner we can start doing this the better, as we want to start building up the colour and a transition on all of those raised edges. That's why when applying this layer I'm mostly using the tip of my brush and painting in small, sharp, jagged motions. I don't want to use the side of my brush too much, as I'm trying to have a little bit of irregularity and texture which I'm building up on the surface. Of course, this is going to be incredibly subtle at first and almost indistinguishable. However, once we start adding our highlight layers, this style of brush stroke is going to help us build up all of those nice striations. So it's better to start practicing that brush motion now while it's a little bit less visible. I've now created a 1-to-1 mix of Incubi Darkness and Lupercal Green on my wet palette, and I've got this slightly thinner than the previous stage. I'm going to be brushing this on very much in the same way as that previous layer, but I'm going to leave behind even more of that previous stage. Unlike where I was just trying to target the recesses in the first step, I'm now going to be covering only about 75% of each of those armour segments. Now I've just got some Lupercal Green thinned down on my palette by itself, and I'm going to be painting again a layered approach over the top of that surface of the previous step, leaving behind about 25% of that previous stage, building up a transition of colour towards the tip of each of those armour segments. As the paint is so thin, it is going to be quite subtle in terms of the colour change. However, we're going to be building this up in multiple thin layers, and as we start adding progressive colours over the top, we're going to get a nice smooth blend and transition. And now finally, before we start working on our edge highlights, I'm going to add a mix of 2-to-1 Sons of Horus Green and Lupercal Green. I'm going to concentrate this really just on the tips of each of these armour segments now. I'm trying to make a note of being even more sharp and jagged with my brush strokes so that we can start to build up a bit of a pre-highlight before we add some sharper, refined ones. Now that all of that glazing is complete, I'm going to start adding some layered highlights with Sons of Horus Green. I've got a smaller brush here with a really nice sharp tip, loaded up with a controlled amount of paint. I'm going to be following not only all of the edges, but also all of those striations and sculpted detail, and where the surface is slightly flatter, I'm going to paint some sharp lines on that as well to give us a nice consistent finish. And where the side of an armour segment is exposed, we can paint just a controlled edge highlight along that edge. Now we're going to start adding some lovely contrast to all of that sculpted detail, and to do that I'm using a 1-to-1 mix of Sons of Horus Green and Deepkin Flesh. That gives us an almost off-white colour which we can use to pick out all of those striations, and remember that we're trying to work within that previous step, so we're leaving some of that previous stage exposed and trying to paint within the width of that line rather than completely on top of it. Try to avoid painting smooth edge highlights with the side of your brush and instead use the tip with a jagged vibrating motion with your hand so that you can add some texture and chipping to the edge of each of those armour segments, and that's going to give it a much more realistic look and keep the lines nice and sharp at the same time. Now we're going to add even more contrast and make the armour segments look sharper and more jagged by adding some controlled highlights towards the tips and corners of each of the armour segments, and first of all I'm using Deepkin Flesh to do that. Focus less on the striations themselves and instead on the actual sculpted edges of each of these armour segments, and pick out some sharp corners where you think that they would catch more light or potentially more wear. Well, a massive thank you for sticking around to the end of this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed the tutorial and you found it helpful for your painting. If you did like it, why not give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified when we upload more tutorials, and check out the channel for all of our other videos as well. Don't forget that you can find the full extended masterclass of our tutorials on Patreon. It's the place to get the best tips for miniature painting, so check the link in the description. Otherwise, a massive thank you once again, and I'll see you in the next video.